Hi, Pali. I'm really glad to have you on here. I'm really looking forward to doing this interview and really kind of understanding your perspective on current events as well as emotional regulation and what that means for you with all the background and everything that you bring to mental health in Delaware. So, can you start by giving an introduction about yourself and letting everyone know your work history, your education history, what you're currently doing, where you're currently working, things like that?
Yes, so my name is Pali Payne. I'm a proud LCSW. Currently, I have a couple of jobs. I am a professor at Dell State. I'm an adjunct instructor at Temple University. I additionally have my own private practice where I do mostly work with children and families, but I do have some adults as well that I see. Additionally, I work at schools. And lastly, but not least, I work with populations that have been incarcerated, trying to help them kind of transition back into the community.
Awesome. Very cool. Thank you.
I like to work. I like
So
what
I
I
was
do.
about to say, so you obviously have a lot of jobs and a lot of stuff going on right now. Um, that's awesome. So you and I met when I was doing my internship at a school where you used to work. With is an alternative school, so kids with behavior problems, with legal issues, and disabilities, and different needs like that. So yeah, so I was really glad to have met you in that environment, a place where I could develop my skills and learn from you as well. So really glad to have you on here and be able to share this with everyone else as well. So I think the thing that's on everybody's mind, the forefront of everybody's mind right now, is of course the racial climate in America, and protests happening with that, and people trying to really work on civil rights of minority groups in America right now. So definitely wanted to hear your thoughts on that, but I wanted to preface that with something that you told me years ago that I thought was just one of the coolest things I've ever heard. You had told me that your family is able to trace your ancestors back to a plantation, and that some people in your family are very interested in that, to see where you came from, where your family came from, and to see kind of the progress that's happening now. And I think that plays right into you and everything we're talking about. So I really wanted to highlight how your family is able to show we came from this part in our life where literally being owned by other people, to where you're a highly educated Black woman in America, and you're really making so much progress and gains for yourself, but also for society as a whole. And I really wanted to highlight that as well. So could you just give me your thoughts on the current climate, racial injustice and things like that in America right now?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Actually, it's important because my father is the first college graduate of his generation. I'm the second college graduate. I guess 2 or 3 days ago, my sister became the fourth, and my brother, they're twins, was the third. So, kind of, education has always been the way that my family has talked about changing things in our society. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something that we take very seriously. It's the reason I'm in a doctorate program right now, fourth year, um, trying to change things in the mental health field. Um, but I have to be honest, right? Education and academic system, just like any other system, has issues, and has things that all systematic racism that also needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's interesting that today, my specialty is emotional regulation. That's what I deal with, and kind of how I've been trying to regulate myself, how I've been trying to cope through this time, how I've been trying to honor my ancestors, but also take care of myself, taking breaks, but also being able to talk about the difficult conversations
Mm-hmm.
and have those difficult conversations, because people have a right and, are upset, right? And I don't want to say, oh, my family got our education, everyone else can too, right? Because it's not that easy. um, there's luck. There's determination as well, there's hard work as well. But kind of understanding my privilege, and, being thankful for my privilege, but using my privilege, using my voice to be able to get an education, to be able to embed myself hopefully in the mental health field, and to be able to change other people that maybe don't have these privileges. And also being able to talk about systematic racism and how we can do, as a community, do different things to kind of change and improve this community. With that said as well, I'm trying to model, especially for my siblings, taking breaks. Because sometimes you can't always be on. Sometimes my friend, there was a protest going on. I can't remember exactly, but I was on vacation. I was like, oh, I should be out there with them. And she told me, sometimes vacation is a form of like protest as well. Like, you can't be doing everything. And I said, oh my goodness, that's so true, right? I need to take care of myself. Shout out to Chantello, that was her. But she's right? So kind of trying to balance all these things as well as my emotions, in a way to force progress.
That's so awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I found it really interesting that that you use the word privilege, which is a word that that somebody who's white like myself comes across pretty often, right? As I recognize my own privilege, the privilege of majority race people in America, things like that. But it's interesting that you would use that as a Black woman in America. But of course, I understand your point is that you have some things available to you that maybe others, your own race or others, may not have. So I think that's an excellent point. You may have difficult experiences yourself, but you're also trying to understand the difficult experiences of others. And that's a really interesting point to make. That's I appreciate you thinking like that. So
Just to add one other piece to that, I think that's the only way we kind of move forward.
mm,
I think if we're not able to recognize, some of the privileges that we have, right? It's very easy to say they shouldn't do this or they shouldn't do that instead of acknowledging pain. And I think because we don't acknowledge pain, that's why we're where we're at right now, right? We don't understand what everyone else is going through. So I think it's important to try to listen to people, especially as a therapist, right? Listen to people.
yeah.
We could even talk a little bit about that, different sides of being a therapist and, being able to listen to people. But hearing them and helping them process their frustration, their pain, their outrage, and helping them heal.
Well, that's a good point. How does the racial injustice, the current climate of racial tension, things like that, how does that play into your private practice or just your counseling experience right now?
Yes. So depending on where I'm working, I'm dealing with very different populations. And as a therapist, it's very different than, being a person, right? I think people miss that sometimes. It's not like giving your friend advice. There's things that we're taught, especially depending on the modality you're taught in, how you teach others, how you provide psychoeducation, how you don't turn people off of your message.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I don't say I'm being fake, but I definitely have to modulate myself, right?
Yeah.
And it's important that I do that as well, because if I don't, we don't grow, right? If I tell someone, no, your opinion's wrong, we don't grow. And in a therapy setting, it is not about me, right? It is
Right.
not, in that setting, it really is not about me. It's about that person, what they're feeling, giving them a space to process. And if they ask for certain, education, if they ask for that, but the best education I can give is how I represent myself. And it can be difficult, right? People can say things that you're like, what? I mean, we could have a whole other conversation on people saying things that I'm like, oh my goodness, wasn't ready for this one, right?
Oh yeah.
At the same time, how I reacted, how I treated them, that changes things as well.
Absolutely.
And it was not easy, but it does change things as well.
Yeah. Well, and that's another good point you bring up too. Conversations, especially now, can be very difficult, right? Conversations around race, conversations around how we treat other people, conversations about our communities as a whole, policing, things like that. So it's very easy, as you alluded to, it's very easy to feel like you're saying the wrong thing, right? So like if I talk about being a white man in America and I talk about you being a Black woman in America, it's very easy for me to say something that I don't realize shows my privilege, shows my ignorance even, and shows maybe that I'm not listening like I need to be, you know? So you bring up a really good point. We're all on the forefront of that, need to realize what we're saying, how we're saying it, who we're saying it to, and try to understand that person's experience and the lens that they're thinking through, things like that. So you bring up some really excellent points, um, and some things we all need to be thinking about continuously. Yeah. So thank you for that. So the topic that 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 you brought up earlier, emotional regulation. Another one that during times like this is very important. People need to be able to regulate their thoughts, maybe their feelings, especially with so many difficult things happening in the world, right? People feeling hurt, people feeling like they don't have a voice, things like that. Being able to regulate ourselves so that we don't do or say the wrong thing, something we regret. Um, but also just with students, people who are learning about themselves, about the world, being able to regulate yourself so that you can make a difference, so that you can make a difference that makes sense too. If you are yelling, screaming at people, you know, especially for those students that are still trying to learn, it isn't always effective. But if you can figure out ways to regulate yourself, then maybe you have more effect. It's a difficult thing to do. So can you speak to that emotional regulation? Can you tell us from your perspective, what does emotional regulation mean? Why is it important?
So emotional regulation is something I deal with all the time, dealing with children and even going into dealing with people who were previously incarcerated. So what exactly is emotional regulation? It's your ability to control yourself, right? And it can seem like a very simple thing, but it's not for many. And there's many things that influence why regulating yourself is not easy, right? So you can go from things as far as children role modeling what their parents do, sometimes just reinforcement behaviors that aren't healthy, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can also look at trauma because that also we see the part of the brain that helps us regulate is impacted negatively by trauma. I'm oversimplifying, but this is the basic gist of it. Making it hard to regulate.
Right.
So it is one of these skills that I do many different things with kids, and we can talk about that, and adults, to try to help them regulate themselves, to kind of put them in a better situation, to be able to function in society, right? With that said, I think something that a lot of clinicians mess up on, I guess mess up, not the best word, but we could do better, we could improve, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that we judge the reaction that people have. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that closes them off. And I think moving forward, what we need to do is validate their experience and help them identify the feelings that they are feeling, right? Um, and then, help them and teach these regulation skills. Now, this also depends on what setting you're in, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I'm just gonna be blunt, right? A kid who's has a pretty good life, is living in a nice house, who's kicking walls in, I'm probably gonna address that a little bit differently than maybe a child who has two parents that are not regulating themselves.
Yeah.
Is in a school system that is, maybe a bit rougher than other school systems, right? So you really have to kind of change your approach to fit what you're trying to accomplish. And I think that's also, it's not just a textbook or, a workbook, but really working with that child and understanding everything holistically so that you can help them make that change and really see where their goals are and where they want to be.
Yeah, and that can be really difficult work for both the therapist, but also for the student or the kid or the adolescent, because they don't realize, oftentimes, they don't realize that they are that way, right? They don't realize I can do better than this, or they don't realize I'm not regulated right now. Um, and how do you make someone? How do you help someone understand something that they've never understood? How do you help someone understand I I'm not at a place where I could be,
Mhm.
and how do I get there because I've never felt it before. That's very, very difficult work, I imagine, from the eyes of the perspective of that person you're working with. So that's a really good point. Can you speak to how someone becomes emotionally regulated, or how someone can be taught that?
Yes, so we know that there's a great treatment, actually PCIT, that helps parents with children. And actually now the research on PCIT is really growing, right? So it used to be just children that were kind of abused and maltreated. But it's moved on to like dealing with children with anxiety, dealing with depression, dealing with toddlers, like just all different populations.
Yeah.
So that if the child is younger is kind of my first defense, because it can kind of has so much good research that it kind of helps everyone, right?
Right.
I will say with that, I am still being trained in the method, but I do it under supervision, so I don't want to get in trouble for that. But it really is the best empirically based kind of service. I'm going to talk about the older kids in just a second. But that modality really teaches how to speak to children, because when you're that young, right, how you're reinforced is how you're reinforced. So we can kind of change how the parent reinforces the child, how the child responds, how we're offering attention. Typically that self-awareness, we still want them to have it, but it's a little bit different of a process. When we get older, right, that's really more when we have to start having those conversations with the teenagers, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the adults. Something I love is cognitive reappraisal. So kind of looking at the situation from other people's perspectives. But one of the most simple things that us working with children can do is model emotional regulation. So I've had many times where things have happened and the kid is just looking at me to flip out and I don't. And that teaches, oh, okay. So some people don't like get really upset and throw things. Like that doesn't have to be the answer if I'm upset, right?
Right.
The power of role modeling is huge, huge, really huge.
Yeah, awesome points. So you mentioned a couple different things: PCIT, parent-child interaction therapy, as a way of not only just trying to reach the kid, but you also need to teach or maybe reteach the parent how to do those things, right? How to interact with their kid, and kind of retraining that whole family dynamic, right? About how that interaction has previously happened and how you can change that to therefore change that whole dynamic and hopefully change that child's behavior or thought process as well. Very good. So, and then other things, looking through other people's perspective to understand that scenario or that things that are happening, with that kid or that family. But as they gain more of that understanding, the awareness of themselves, that's when you can, correct me if I'm wrong, when you can really start to speak to them as an individual, right? So you're dealing with the parents, I'm sure, at times, but you're really starting to have them formulate their own self, their own personality, and what that looks like in a general sense, right? How do I interact with the world? How do I interact with others? How do I process my own thoughts, things like that. So, I appreciate that multifaceted kind of answer. There's a ton of different things we can do, but ultimately, if I'm not showing that behavior to them, if I'm not showing how I can regulate myself, then they're probably just going to push your buttons the whole time and get you to react. And we've all been there.
Yeah.
We've all been there when we've realized, I am not showing these kids how to do it. I am reacting to them. I am not doing
Acknowledging
this right.
that, acknowledging it, acknowledging I'm having an issue right now and I need to take a break.
Right.
Just
Yeah,
good role modeling.
there's nothing wrong with that. Taking a break, recognizing I am not doing this right. Yeah,
I'm not doing this right.
right. That's
This is
awesome. That's
messed
awesome.
up.
That's
I
awesome.
also want to add that this is also very good for children that suffer from ADHD.
Sure.
The mindfulness portion and the self-awareness. Because if you're running, right, it's okay. And there's a lot of talents and skills that come from having ADHD. But we want to help them be a little bit more mindful of their activities and what they're doing and help them refocus.
Sure. Yeah. So awareness of themselves, awareness of what they are feeling, thinking, what's going through their mind, the unconscious kind of thoughts even. That's good. That's good. Mindfulness historically for me has been something of I've been cynical of it,
Okay.
and uh, that was an error on my part. I'll say that to begin with, um, because I initially associated it with, like, some uh, somebody sitting on a beach doing yoga, and I was like, I don't want to be that person. But I realized pretty quickly that that's not the case. That it's not about being some weird person on a yoga mat everywhere in the world or on a cliff somewhere, but instead it was all about learning about yourself, all about understanding yourself in that moment, and realizing how that helps you, realizing, what am I doing, what am I thinking, what am I feeling, and how do I use those feelings, thoughts, and actions to really contribute better to the world around me. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's something I had to grow in.
I was the same way. I laughed because I was the same way. At first, I was like, I have all these things I need to do, and I have paperwork, and who has time for meditation? But yeah, it is about being aware, being present, and regulating.
I just had a memory of you teaching mindfulness to students at that school where you're at, and it can be very difficult, for kids, for anybody that's not buying into it.
Was that the food one?
I don't remember the specific
I have the best
topic.
luck with the food. If you feed them and we gotta, okay, we can't eat the gum, we can't eat the grape, we gotta be mindful with it, and then we can eat it. Best success with that one.
Now that you say that, I do remember that one. You also taught me. The one with the Skittles. Like, if you pick a green Skittle out, you ask this certain question. If you pick a red Skittle out, you answer this certain question. So you're right. Food's important.
You're not too much, but within reason.
Yeah. Right. Cool. So then I think probably the last question that we would want to ask to wrap this up is, we've talked about regulation. We've talked about how therapists can contribute to that work of helping a kid or a student uh, regulate their emotions. We've talked about perhaps what that looks like in the current climate with everything that people are feeling right now. So then, what happens if somebody doesn't regulate their emotions? What does that person look like? What are they doing? What are they feeling? And there's obviously many extremes to
Yeah.
people that don't regulate their emotions. But what does that look like?
So we can just take it from a basic level. If we think about people with issues with regulating emotions, typically have higher anxiety, typically have higher depression, because it truly is the inability to not be able to control yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the reasons it's so important. And I think sometimes people think it's just like, if you don't regulate yourself, you're going to end up in jail, which is possible. We could have another session on the prison system, but we're not going to go there.
Right.
But with that said, right, it also could mean that you could have really bad anxiety. It also can mean really bad depression, right? So it is so important to be able to kind of gain these skills and teach them at a young age, but you can still teach them at an older age as well, so that you're able to kind of have a more, I would say, functional kind of adaptive life, right? So it does look like discomfort, right? We talk about a frustration tolerance, right? We want to build frustration tolerance, right? But it's true, we do. We want to build this kind of resiliency that you're able to modulate yourself so that you can get through tough times, because times get tough. Times really do get tough, and we want to build those skills. So it just kind of looks like not being able to deal with tough times.
Yeah, resiliency. I'm glad you brought that word up, because that is really so key. Because there will be times where we feel like we make progress, but then we might blow up at someone, or we might yell at someone, and well, I thought I was learning something, or I thought I was doing better, when in fact you were. But you may have just had a momentary relapse. You may not have dealt with that situation before, whatever it might have been. But resiliency, building that in, and building up resilient children and teenagers to realize, you know, I may have made a mistake, but I can keep going. I may have made a mistake, but I can do better next time. I may have made a mistake, but people are giving me grace and I can go ahead and do better next time. Things like that. I'm glad you brought that word up.
And we all make mistakes.
Right.
We are not
Right.
perfect.
Right.
We have all yelled. We did all yell.
We've all reacted to behavior. We have all
Yes.
sent the wrong thing in that email or that text or on that phone call. But here we are, you know, here we are talking about progress that we're making. Here we are talking about progress that students have been making. Here we are talking about some really wonderful things that people all over the world are doing to help themselves, to help others, and just to help the world in general. So there's a lot of chances for encouragement in this conversation, just in general. There's a lot of chances for people to realize their own strengths and their own things that they contribute and stuff like that. So
and weaknesses, right? Because we all have weaknesses as well.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. 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 So is there anything else that you wanted to add that we had talked about?
No, it was great seeing you.
All right. Well, I appreciate you being on here, and thanks so much for all the thoughts that you shared, and all the stuff you're doing too. I mean, all the people that you work with, private practice, different agencies, teaching, the doctoral work that you're doing, and everything that I'm sure is everything you're doing that's going to contribute to the world as a whole. And everything that's going to come out of that too. I'm sure that once you get your degree, that you'll be able to go on to many things that you've been really looking forward to. So that's really cool.
And Jeff, I want to thank you too for your work, because it's important as well, right? You do amazing work, and yeah, so you get a shout out.
I appreciate that shout out. All right, well, thank you so much, Pali. Really great to talk to you.